I thought everyone had disappeared. No, they've all come back again. It's fantastic. So I'm going to just have a little chat to you about sculpture, what I think of sculpture myself, and why this design developed in the way that it has done. It was a really serendipitous relationship between myself and David, who has done so much to raise the money for this. But when I realised this was Bowie and all the aspects of Bowie, because he wasn't just a pop star, he really was a performance artist. And that gave me so much to work with that producing this sculpture became a kind of natural progression. So design is something I think that sort of, you need to go more or less with what pops into your mind. And when I'm thinking about something, I let it rest, I know what I've got to do, and then the design pops out. And once the design's there, you can discuss the details, sort out all the little nuances that need to be put into a sculpture, but the design's the key to it. And the thought process behind this is when you look at most sculptures of pop stars, they're all standing like that, flashing like that, with their guitar, and it's a very, very static looking sculpture, and from a distance it looks like you're looking at a busker. So I wanted something that was really, really different. Historically, sculpture has always been used to portray the great and the good. So our famous and great friend up there, John Hampden, is typical of how sculpture is always perceived. It's a great man, beautifully sculpted on a plinth, and that's it. Painting, on the other hand, historically has always told a story. It's always had a narrative with it. Sculpture never had, so what I've done is taken that narrative and taken my sculpture and combined the two things together, so that not only do you get the wow factor of seeing a sculpture, which I hope you get from this, but you also get drawn into it by the composition and the stories that are told within this. So just to recap on how this developed, is that obviously the man here, his persona is Ziggy Stardust, which I vaguely remember only in that he was killing Ziggy Stardust off. And I remember thinking to myself, who was Ziggy Stardust? I was very young at the time. But this is what the connection with Aylesbury is, which I think is a fantastic heritage and connection, really exciting. And what I've done is presented Ziggy Stardust from, inspired by a photograph of him sitting on a speaker. And the speaker is in shadow, so you can't really see it. And it just was an inspiring way of portraying him, rather than that static look with a guitar. So it broke away from that, gave us something unusual. And then to have the older Bowie standing behind, looking back reflectively on his former self, is something that is unusual. So I wanted to give Aylesbury something that would resonate in people's minds, not just as a sculpture, but as this composition. And because he was such an amazing performance artist, because he kept inventing himself, I had this fantastic wall of the Crown Court behind to be able to tell a story, which is very unusual in a sculpture, to do it in such a complex manner. So I'm just going to run through this briefly with you, just so that for those of you that haven't looked into it and don't understand what it's all about, it gives you an insight into what was going on at the time in my mind. So we've got the spiders from Mars, because the spiders from Mars were actually created here, which is quite something, and David was very much a witness to that. And this is what Bowie looked like in 1969 when he sung Space Oddity. And there's Major Tom in his spacecraft reaching out to the Earth and the Moon. He's already pretty much dead there, because he's a skeleton in actual fact, if you look closely. He then, after the Ziggy Stardust era, he recreated himself as Aladdin Sane, which people often get muddled up actually. The lightning strike is Aladdin Sane, the gold disc is Ziggy Stardust. And I took the image from his iconic album with the golden teardrop on his clavicle, and then portrayed him again looking up at his next persona, which was when he sung Life on Mars, at a period where he actually looked more attractive than his wife, I thought. And here is Mars. Underneath is the girl with mousy hair hooked to the silver screen. Do you remember the lyrics from that? So what I've done is put those lyrics into this piece Staring back at her from the silver screen, if you look closely, is David Bowie smoking a cigarette. And if you remember the lyrics, mother said no, father said go, and her friend was nowhere to be seen. Well, she'd obviously got herself pregnant. It was a kind of reflection of the morals of the time, wasn't it? So I thought David Bowie is a good candidate to be staring back at her from the silver screen in this particular instance. Then we move on to Labyrinth, where he played Jareth, the Goblin King. And those of you that are fans, actually, of the film will notice that there is a deliberate error here, that the clock in Labyrinth had 13 hours, not 12. Obviously, I knew that, it was a deliberate error. And that makes the sculpture unique. Then we've got Bowie as the man that fell to earth in his alien guise, which I really quite like, actually, because funny enough, he really does look like Bowie there. There's a real lovely Bowie look to his bald head and his slitty pupils. And then we've got Pierrot from the iconic video that he did for Ashes to Ashes, where again we revisit Major Tom, who is here floating in space with his guitar floating away from him, because at this time now we all know that Major Tom's a junk food, if you remember that. Then I took another image that I really wanted to get in because he smoked all his life, so getting these aspects of Bowie in, every part of who he was portrayed beautifully by this photograph of him as the Thin White Duke, which was done by Time magazine in New York, and represented here with the triangle and the circle in the background, which is images and shapes and designs that I really love getting into a piece. It gives something like this a resonance that is unique to the piece. And then we move into the final period of his life, the dark star, is it Dark Star, Black Star? Black Star, where he was really coming to terms with his own mortality, really, and his own death. And we've got the two faces here that are distorted, which for a sculptor is a very difficult thing to do, because people are going to turn around and go, oh no, he hasn't got that right, it's distorted. But of course, it was filmed through a kind of fisheye lens, so the faces were distorted. And then we've got the iconic image of him from that very dark scene where he's struggling with death, basically. And he's portrayed himself with bandages around his face and buttons for eyes, which I thought was a pretty scary image, actually, and very resonant, really, of probably how he was feeling at the time. Then we've got the rocket from his musical play, Lazarus, where he revisited the man that fell to earth, who is now an old man, trying to get back to the stars. And what I've done is I've linked the spoil from the rocket to the entire design. So everything about Bowie's career came from the Starman. That's what he said, that's who Ziggy Stardust was. He was a messenger here for us, basically, from outer space. So that links the whole story back together again. And then just above the Lazarus rocket are two iconic photographs just before he died. One on the top is kind of saying goodbye, which I think is really rather a lovely one. And underneath is the image of him in his fedora. Again, I think it was taken in New York, where somehow he looked young again. I don't know what it is about that photograph, but you can see the young face of Bowie in that, which I thought was really appropriate. And then rather oddly, there is a poem there by a guy that was my patron for about 12 years, a chap called Felix Dennis, who was a very controversial figure, but he was a publisher and a poet, and he had to face his death as well, knowing that he was going to die, and wrote a poem about it called I Just Stepped Out, but I think it's a very moving poem. But the connection is that in the early 70s, Felix Dennis bought Bowie's house off him in Mustique, a place called Mandalay. So there's a connection through Felix Dennis and then through me as an artist as well. So what I've done is trying to layer whole aspects of this story together to make the composition work. And to balance the composition on the other side, we've got a gold album with some of his iconic album covers spaced out onto that. Again, just to pull the composition together And the base is based on his birth sign. So it's Capricorn, and he's the year of the fire dog, apparently. So the fire dog is here, just disappearing underneath the base here. One lovely aspect of this, or one last thing I'd like to leave you with, is that just here, was it in 1971, David? David, by chance, met David Bowie here as he was walking up towards the square. And as though he was rehearsed, David Bowie said, "What's a cool guy like you doing in a small town like this?" And all these years later, here's this sculpture to that. I just love stories like that. I just think it's a really lovely thing. It sort of brings the whole thing together and brings us back to David Stops, who, as I say, has done so much to make all of this possible. And thank you very much. It's been great chatting to you.